What if the spies were right? Not about the giants, not about the fortified cities, not about the armies. What if they were right about something much deeper? Because the spies in Kalev saw the exact same land. They saw the exact same giants. They saw the exact same grapes. They saw the exact same funerals. Yet one group saw obstacles and one man saw a mission. Why? Because the sin of the spies was never really about what they saw. It was about how they interpret what they saw. And that mistake didn't end in the desert, but rather it has followed the Jewish people for thousands of years. The spies, they saw obstacles. Kalev saw the mission. The spies saw facts. Kalev saw purpose. And that difference still determines Jewish history today. Therefore, to understand this, we have to start with Kalev. The Torah tells us that before the spies returned, Kalev separated from the group and went to Hebron. The sages explain that he went there to pray at the graves of the patriarchs. Now, think about that. Why did Kalev need to pray? I mean, he was super spiritual? The simple answer would be because he was righteous. But the deeper answer is exactly the opposite. He went to pray because he realized that he was not immune. He was thinking exactly like them. He saw the giants. He saw the same armies. He saw the same dangers. He heard the same conversations. He felt the same fears. And he realized that if he relied on his own understanding, he might end up exactly where the spies ended up. So he prayed, not for success, not for honor, not for leadership to change other people's minds. He prayed for his own clarity. He prayed not to lose faith. And that alone changes the entire narrative. Because suddenly, the spies were no longer villains. They became understandable. They became us. Most people imagine the spies standing in Israel terrified because they thought about themselves that they were little grasshoppers, these little tiny grasshoppers. But that's not what the Torah says. The spies said, we were in our own eyes like grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. Notice the difference. Think carefully about that statement. How exactly did they know what was in the minds of the inhabitants of the land? The spies were projecting their own fears onto everyone else. They felt small, they felt insignificant, they felt incapable, and therefore they assumed everyone else saw them the same way. When in fact, there's no evidence that this is the case. Furthermore, in fact, later, when Joshua sends spies into the land, Pinchas and Kalev, Rachav tells them something completely different. Everyone has heard what happened in Egypt, she says. Everybody heard about the crossing of the sea. Everybody heard about the giving of the Torah. Everyone heard about the great miracles that took place for the Jewish people. Everyone is terrified of the Jewish people. In fact, the inhabitants of the land were not looking at the Jewish people as insects. The spies were looking at themselves that way. And that may be one of the deepest lessons in this entire story. Many times, the limitations we see around us are actually the limitations we believe about ourselves. The spies were not reporting reality. They were reporting on their own interpretation of reality. And there's a huge difference. The spies weren't cowards. They were the greatest leaders of the Jewish people. Princes. Nesiim, they're called. heads of tribes, spiritual giants, handpicked by Moshe and approved by God. They looked at the situation and reached a logical conclusion. This land cannot be conquered naturally. And they were right. It could not be conquered naturally. And it still can't be conquered naturally. And that was never the point. The entire Exodus was supernatural. The plagues, every plague was supernatural. The splitting of the sea was supernatural. The manna was supernatural. The clouds of glory were supernatural. Everything about the journey was teaching the Jewish people one lesson. You do your part. God does the impossible part. The spies looked at reality and stopped there. Kalev looked at reality and remembered God. And then something fascinating happens. When the spies return, the nation begins listening to them. It's on Tisha B'Av night, they come back, and the atmosphere becomes very negative. Everybody starts crying. The momentum is moving in one direction. And Kalev, realizing that nobody is listening, so what does he do? He's actually the first clickbaiter. The sages tell us that Kalev stood up, got everyone's attention by making them think he was about to attack Moshe. Suddenly, everyone became silent. He pretended to be on their side. Finally, someone is going to tell the truth. And once he had their attention, he switched. He turned everything around. And he said, Eloi na'aleh, we can do this. We should go up. We can inherit the land. Why? Because God is with us. Notice what Kalev understood. Kalev understood that sometimes if you want to influence people, you first have to understand how they think. He knew exactly what the spies were feeling because he had felt it himself. And then we come to one of the most overlooked parts of the entire story, the story of the grapes. The Torah describes the spies carrying enormous clusters of fruit from the land. But the Midrash actually tells us something remarkable. In fact, the spies didn't want to take the fruit. They said, we don't want to show the rest of the people how good this land is. But Kalev insisted. And according to the Midrash, he told them that if they refused, they would have to kill him first. Why was he so determined? He was determined because the fruit was the evidence that the land is extraordinary. It was overflowing with blessing. The spies saw giants. Kalev saw giant grapes. The spies saw obstacles. Kalev saw promises. The spies saw reasons to retreat. Kalev saw reasons to advance. They were looking at the same reality and seeing two entirely different worlds. And what's fascinating about this is that this pattern appears throughout the entire story. The spies entered the land, and everywhere they went, they saw funerals. People were dying. Mourning was taking place. Everywhere they looked, they saw tragedy. Therefore, they reached the conclusion that this land consumes its inhabitants. This land is a dangerous place to live. This land is a bad land. But the Midrash tells us they completely misunderstood what they were seeing. God had arranged for important people to die throughout the land so that everyone would become distracted. Instead of watching the spies, the inhabitants were occupied with funerals. So what looked like a curse was actually a blessing. What looked like a problem was actually God's protection. What looked like evidence against the land was actually evidence that God was helping them. And that was the spies' mistake from the beginning to the end. The giants became proof they couldn't succeed. The funerals became proof that the land was evil. Their fears became proof that everyone looked down on them and saw them as grasshoppers. But Kalev saw the exact same reality and came to the opposite conclusion. The grapes were actually proof of the blessing. The land was proof of promise. The mission was proof that God believed in them. And this brings us to the most important phrase in the entire story. The sages explain that the word ma'od, very, often points to beyond the ordinary, beyond the natural, beyond what can be explained by normal calculations. The spies looked at Israel through the lens of nature. Kalev looked at Israel through the lens of destiny. The spies asked, "Can this be done? Can we go into the land?" Kalev asked, "What does God want us to do?" And those are completely different questions. Then comes the tragedy. The people cry. The night was Tisha B'Av, and our sages tell us that God said, "You, the Jewish people, have cried for no reason. I will establish this night, as a night of crying for generations." Think about what happened. The Jewish people weren't rejecting a piece of land. They were rejecting the belief that God can work through them. They were rejecting the idea that the impossible can become possible. And every single generation has faced that exact same test. Will we just look at reality and stop there? Or will we remember that Jewish history has never been natural? The story of the spies is not ancient history. It's happening right now. Every generation reaches a moment when it must decide whether to live by fear or faith, whether to focus on the giants or the grapes, whether to focus on obstacles or on opportunities, whether to trust only what it sees or also what God has promised. The question is not only what you see. The question is how you interpret what you see. Because sometimes the very thing you think is standing in your way is actually God clearing the path in front of you. Sometimes what looks like a setback is a preparation. Sometimes what looks like a disaster is actually the protection. Sometimes what looks like it's impossible is exactly where God wants you to go. The spies, they saw obstacles, reasons they can't go. Kalev saw opportunity. The spies saw nature. Kalev saw destiny. The spies saw reasons to return back. Kalev saw reasons to move forward. And every generation faces the same choice. Will we only see the giants, or will we also notice the grapes? Will we focus on the funerals, or will we recognize the hidden hand guiding history? Because the land is not merely good. The land is very, very good. Tova aretz ma'od ma'od. And sometimes the greatest blessing is hidden behind the thing that first appears frightening. That was the test of the spies, and perhaps it is still our test today. Thank you for watching. If you have comments, please comment. I'd love to read them. From Ramat Beit Shemesh, Aaron here, wishing you a great day, good Shabbos. Thank you for watching. Chazak va'amatz. Be strong and courageous.